In just 1 hour of questioning, J.D. Vance attempted to interrupt Jasmine Crockett more than 12 times, but each time she countered even more forcefully. Reports show 3.2 million American families are being left behind in the housing crisis, and Crockett turned the hearing into a direct indictment of the power structure. Cameras captured the moment, security grew tense, and the chamber held its breath. The only question left, who will fall first, the old guard or the barefaced truth? The hearing room on Capitol Hill that morning resembled a vast political stage where every detail radiated an atmosphere of strict ritual laced with suffocating tension. The cold marble walls reflected sharp beams of light. Footsteps echoed on the stone floor like war drums. Television cameras trembled slightly, their lenses panning slowly like invisible eyes waiting to capture a fateful moment. Everyone knew today would leave no room for chance, only truth and fire would collide. J.D. Vance was already seated in the front row, his black suit clinging to him like carefully forged armor. His face betrayed nothing, each gesture, each breath rehearsed 100 times over. Beneath that calm exterior lurked a calculating coldness, the demeanor of a man who understood that every word he would speak could turn into a dagger thrust straight into his opponent. Whispered voices spread through the chamber. He has a trap. He'll shut Crockett down. This will be the knockout. And then the doors swung open. Jasmine Crockett entered, not with a declaration, not with showmanship. Her gaze swept across the room, a blade of light so sharp that anyone who met it instinctively lowered their eyes as if dodging a knife's edge. It wasn't aggression. It wasn't defense. It was the steel composure of a warrior who had stood at the edge of justice's battlefield between life and ruin. An aging congressman tilted his head, his voice trembling. Those eyes, they don't belong to someone who compromises. The chamber split in its silence, one half fixed on Vance, anticipating the scripted spectacle about to unfold. The other half leaning almost imperceptibly toward Crockett, hoping she might pierce through the thick wall of lies before them. Fingers clattered against keyboards, cameras zoomed in on a blink, a tilt of the head, any sign that the storm was about to erupt. Vance smirked just enough for the audience to sense his confidence in the game he was playing, but Crockett did not blink. Her silence was the challenge itself. No need for shouting, no need for noise. Her gaze alone conveyed that this confrontation was not merely a hearing, but a battle to redefine justice in America. And then crack. The gavel struck its echo, booming across the room like the shot of a starting pistol. The murmurs died instantly, replaced by a suffocating stillness. No one dared breathe too loudly. In that deadly silence, a single unspoken question seemed to hang in the air, pressing down on every chest like a stone slab. When the gavel fell, did anyone truly know what was about to ignite? J.D. Vance rose slowly, each movement deliberate as though choreographed long before this day. He leaned toward the microphone, his voice low but icy, every syllable dropping like nails into a coffin. Poverty, he intoned, each syllable carved sharp, is not the product of injustice, but the inevitable result of failed leadership in cities run by the opposition. The chamber convulsed. Pens froze in mid-stroke. Lenses tightened their focus, desperate to capture every flicker on his face. Vance leaned forward, hands clasped his eyes, glowing under the lights like a predator scenting prey. A half-smile curled on his lips, not of joy, but of the certainty that his trap was flawless, that no one could slip free. His voice rang across the thickened air. Blaming the system is the easy escape, but the truth lies in the streets they govern. Garbage, violence, unemployment, all of it born not of fate, but of weak hands. A few lawmakers nodded. Some in the audience murmured. But it was Jasmine Crockett's silence that smothered the room. She did not interrupt, did not frown, did not even drum her fingers. Her eyes stayed locked on Vance, so still that for an instant his confidence faltered, as if his carefully sharpened words were nothing more than echoes, bouncing uselessly against stone. That silence was thunder, waiting to crack. A storm not yet formed, but whose scent filled every breath. In the gallery, a young reporter whispered, "She's going to strike back." But when a veteran senator tapped a finger slowly against the desk, counting the beats to detonation, and across television screens nationwide, no one needed commentary to understand they could feel the injustice burning naked in the air. and Crockett's silence itself was becoming the flame to consume the illusion of objective justice. Vance ended with a final thrust. That is not prejudice. That is truth. He sank back into his chair, radiating satisfaction. The posture of a man convinced he had delivered the perfect opening blow. But he didn't see it, the shift in the room. The way anticipation twisted the way the silence sharpened. As he sat, the chamber itself seemed to lean forward, waiting not for his words to sink, but for the explosion Crockett had hidden in her stillness. The question had changed. It was no longer whether she would answer. It was this: could one voice, steady and alone, bend the crushing weight of history, pressing down on that table, or would it be buried beneath the dust of corrupted power? Jasmine Crockett lifted the microphone slowly. Her hand did not tremble. Her gaze remained fixed on J.D. Vance, cutting through the icy armor he had just donned. When her voice came, it wasn't loud, it wasn't sharp. It was soft, so soft the room expected a calm explanation. But every word carried the weight of decades abandoned. You call it poor management. I call it systemic theft. The chamber shifted. Note-takers froze, pens suspended mid-sentence. A reporter lowered his camera without realizing it, eyes wide, as he understood she wasn't just rebutting him. She was renaming reality. The murmurs behind them drained into silence, leaving a taut string of anticipation stretched across the room. Crockett didn't glance at papers. Her words came as though pulled from bone and blood. I grew up where schools had to sell cookies to buy textbooks, where hospitals shut their doors because there was no funding, where streets lay in darkness because there wasn't enough money to change a single light bulb. You call that mismanagement, I call it a sentence America handed down to communities like mine. Her tone stayed even, but each sentence sliced through the air like a blade. Vance's expression darkened. His smirk faltered. He tried to sit composed, but the quick dart of his eyes toward allies betrayed the unease breaking through. Crockett didn't need to raise her voice. Her calmness made every word a spear. She wasn't striking with outrage, she was striking with scars, with memories no statistic could erase. Viewers at home didn't hear just a congresswoman. They heard the echo of stolen childhoods of generations, cast aside of stories America preferred to keep off camera. And it was precisely this contrast, her calm against the brutality of truth, that tightened hearts and riveted eyes to the screen. When she paused, the silence no longer felt empty. It became a crushing weight pressing into every chest in that chamber. A congressional aide whispered, "This is only the beginning." And he was right. Crockett tilted her head slightly, her eyes gleaming like the glint of lightning before the storm. She delivered her final words, each one deliberate. If you think you've painted the picture, then I'm sorry. I will tear it apart in front of the whole of America. It wasn't the climax. It was only the first shot in the storm she was about to unleash. J.D. Vance refused to let the silence linger. He cut in voice, pitched a note higher, clawing back the initiative. But look at the crime rates. Look at the crumbling cities. Are those not proof of collapse? The words cracked through the chamber, sharp and deliberate. Yet what unsettled the audience wasn't the statistics themselves. It was the stench of what lay beneath them. Those criminals, those broken cities, everyone in the room knew exactly who he meant, even though he never said the words aloud. A murmur rippled through the hearing, not because Vance had said anything new, but because everyone heard what he thought he could disguise: the unmistakable sound of a political dog whistle. Cameras swung, snapping up frowns, jaws clenched, tight flashes of rage across the room. People weren't hearing numbers. They were hearing an old strategy blaming already wounded communities. Crockett didn't flinch. She didn't interrupt. She didn't tap her fingers on the desk to demand the floor. She simply waited. And when she spoke, the air snapped taut, as if the entire chamber had been dragged across a single sharp wire. You bring numbers, she said, her gaze never leaving him, but those numbers don't tell us who was abandoned, who was neglected, who was forced to live in conditions you've never tasted. Her tone never rose, but each word slid across the table like a honed blade cutting through the polished veneer of his rhetoric. Vance raised an eyebrow, but she didn't let him breathe. You talk about crime, I talk about communities starved of investment, stripped of opportunity. You talk about broken cities, I talk about places gutted, bled dry, so others could grow rich. You want a simple picture. I give you the truth, your numbers are not innocent. They are the offspring of policy of choice of power unjustly distributed. From the press gallery came an audible wow, a slip of awe that was swallowed instantly by the thickening air. What was unfolding was no longer a sterile policy debate. It was a collision-hollow slogans dressed in statistics versus lived memory etched in scars. Crockett didn't need to shout. Her steadiness alone turned her voice into the toll of a warning bell. Vance tried to keep his face composed, but the sweat blooming across his forehead betrayed him. The room felt he was losing control while she was seizing the rhythm, pulling the spotlight inch by inch into her hands. And one question now hung heavy as a guillotine blade, waiting to drop. When empty rhetoric collides with truths carved in blood and memory, what can still stand? Jasmine Crockett leaned forward slightly, her hand resting lightly on her folder, but her eyes locked on J.D. Vance with a precision that refused to yield. She was no longer reacting, she was attacking. Her voice came steady, deliberate each syllable, a bullet driven into the fortress of words he had built. "You want numbers?" she asked, pausing half a heartbeat, letting the chamber tighten. "Then here are your numbers. 37 million Americans living in poverty according to federal data. More than 3 million evicted every year because they can't afford rent. That isn't mismanagement. That is the raw, unvarnished reality of America, the reality you want to cover with a sheet." The room swayed. Cameras whipped to capture the aides seated behind Vance. Some bit their lips. Others swiped sweat from their foreheads. They understood statistics were no longer neutral ink on a page. They had become live ammunition fired point blank. Crockett's voice dropped lower now, turning from steel to scalpel, slicing straight into the audience's imagination. "Picture this," she said. "A mother working 2 jobs, staggering home past midnight, only to find an eviction notice slapped on her door. Picture her child standing in that empty room trembling, asking why America has abandoned them." The air thickened. Pens lay still on notebooks. No one dared let ink stain another line. Vance shifted restless, but couldn't break in, not when every eye was transfixed on Crockett, as if her words were painting an invisible film reel before them. And then, without warning, her voice cracked, not with weakness, but with something far more dangerous: memory. "I know that feeling," she said bluntly. "I was evicted as a child. I sat on a stoop clutching the only backpack I had, watching my parents' faces as they realized they had nowhere to take me." The chamber froze. A shock wave rolled across the room, sudden, fierce, electric as lightning. This was no longer politics. This was a wound laid bare, daring everyone to look. J.D. Vance leaned back, but there was no triumph left in his eyes, only the hollow recognition of a man pinned beneath the weight of a truth he could not dismiss. The cameras caught it perfectly, the faltering confidence of power buckling under the gravity of lived memory. When Crockett fell silent, she left a silence so crushing it pressed down on every chest in the room. And in that silence, one question tolled like a bell inside the minds of all who watched. Could the pain of a single child shake the conscience of an entire nation? The chamber could no longer hold its ceremonial mask. Senators exchanged uneasy glances, realizing they weren't witnessing a hearing anymore. They were standing inside a historic clash. The faint smirks had vanished. Pens slipped from fingers. It dawned on them this wasn't routine politics. This was war where every word landed like a strike. J.D. Vance tried to wrestle the floor back, but the current had shifted. Jasmine Crockett straightened her gaze, sweeping the chamber, claiming every inch of space as her own. And then she began to tell stories. Not dry data, but flesh and blood lives, breathing through every word. Terry from Ohio, she began, her voice low but firm. A worker was laid off when the plant closed. He drove trucks across state lines just to afford medicine for his daughter with asthma. In the end, he still lost his home. Terry wasn't lazy. He wasn't a burden. He was an abandoned American. The room fell silent, save for the pounding of someone's heartbeat, loud enough it felt as if the chamber itself was pulsing. But she didn't stop. And then there's Ronnie from the Rust Belt. 12-hour shifts in the steel mill, calloused hands, a bent back. When the mill shut down, Ronnie didn't just lose his job. He lost his identity, his faith that hard work could buy justice. When Ronnie told me his story, he wept like a child. Her words slammed into the chamber, tearing apart the false dichotomy Vance had tried to spin: urban versus rural, black versus white. Crockett was ripping the curtain down in front of Congress and millions watching on live TV. The cameras found Vance. His half-smile had dissolved into a strained frown. Weeks of rehearsed arguments, polished lines, the gleam of preparation, all of it now useless in the face of two ordinary names that carried the force to shatter his slogans. Crockett wasn't a respondent anymore. She had become a storyteller, and every story was a hammer blow, smashing his escape routes to rubble. Senators began shifting uncomfortably in their seats, their eyes darting away as if they too were being judged under the glare of these names. Some lowered their heads, unwilling to risk meeting her gaze, for they knew if she spoke another name, it might belong to one of their own constituents. The hearing had transformed into a battlefield. This was no longer Vance attacking and Crockett defending. It was Crockett's counteroffensive, every sentence an arrow piercing the armor of power. And when her voice finally dipped, leaving behind a silence heavy as storm clouds, the chamber itself seemed to tremble with a single unavoidable question. In this moment, whose story held the soul of the room, his or hers? Got it, I'll give you. Chapter 3, Voices Beyond the Room. 500 words in the same cinematic political thriller tone as before, polishing your draft into flowing, high-impact English prose that feels like it belongs in a prestige drama or documentary narration. The air inside the hearing chamber had grown thick, so dense it seemed even breath carried weight. Jasmine Crockett didn't read from a report. She didn't hold up charts. Instead, she summoned people by name, living, breathing souls struggling not in some faraway land, but here on American soil. She lifted her chin, voice steady but deliberate, each syllable dropping like a stone into still water, rippling outward with force. Leona, 72 years old, once a nurse, now forced to choose between blood pressure medication and her electric bill. She sits in a darkened apartment wrapped in blankets, trembling through the winter. And when I asked her how she survived, she only smiled weary and said, "I live on memories, child, on the days when I still believed America would never abandon me." The chamber fell silent. A staffer in the corner bit down on her lip, struggling to hold composure. Cameras panned to the gallery, catching faces that leaned forward, eyes rimmed with red. But Crockett didn't allow the room to exhale. Her voice sharpened, slicing through the hush. Carlos, a Marine veteran. He lives in a rusted van parked outside a Walmart lot because it is the only home he can afford. When the nights turn bitter cold, he wraps his daughter in his arms, huddled together in the back seat just to keep her warm. He told me, "I wore the uniform to protect my country, but my country could not protect my little girl." The last words lacerated the air so sharp that it almost hurt to hear them spoken aloud. Every eye fixed on her now. No one dared dismiss this as a policy debate. What she was unveiling transcended politics, transcended partisanship. It was a naked indictment of neglect, a ledger written in lives instead of numbers. Pens still. Note-taking stopped. Even the habitual coughs and rustlings of Capitol Hill hearings vanished. The silence was so absolute that Crockett's next words landed with a seismic weight. She raised her gaze, locked it onto J.D. Vance, and spoke with deliberate precision. "These are not numbers. These are lives." The silence that followed was louder than any outcry. Senators shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting downward, as if afraid to meet hers. Shame moved like a contagion, dissolving the political pride that normally armors this room. Vance's lips tightened. He pressed them together, searching for a line, a comeback, but nothing he could say would survive beside what had just been spoken. The cameras zoomed close on Crockett's face, capturing not just anger, but something more dangerous, compassion sharpened into a weapon. And then came the question, low, resonant, hypnotic. But the real question is, does America have the courage to listen to its own cries? The chamber seemed to hold its breath as if the walls themselves were waiting for an answer. Minutes after her final words echoed into silence, the hearing chamber still felt frozen in place. Yet beyond its oak-paneled walls, something had already ignited. A clip 47 seconds long had been clipped, uploaded, and unleashed. It captured Crockett staring straight into Vance's eyes, delivering the line, "These are not numbers, these are lives." On Twitter, it began modestly, dozens of shares, then hundreds. Within minutes, the numbers snowballed into tens of thousands. Reporters still seated in the chamber felt their phones vibrate uncontrollably as notifications stacked like falling dominoes. On TikTok, the youth seized it. Someone set her words to a pulsing drum line, remixing the phrase, "These are not numbers. These are lives," into a hypnotic refrain. Video after video paired the sound with stark images, abandoned neighborhoods, families clutching blankets under bridges, and finally Crockett's unflinching stare. The edits spread like wildfire. Every repost was a hammer strike against the silence that Vance had tried to maintain. On Facebook, the response was quieter but more piercing. Mothers in small towns reposted the clip with trembling captions. "She's talking about us too." Elderly women in rural counties, rarely participants in political debates, passed the video into community groups that usually discuss crops or Sunday sermons. Crockett's name slipped beyond Washington, finding its way into family kitchens, church basements, and roadside diners. Twitter, true to form, was the battlefield. Her supporters hailed her as a warrior of truth. Critics sneered, dismissing her as a performer. Yet the substance of the debate had shifted. No one was discussing J.D. Vance's crime statistics anymore. He had vanished from the feed, drowned beneath a tidal wave of her words. Crockett, without saying a single new syllable, had become the gravitational center of a national conversation. Inside the chamber, Vance finally glimpsed what was unfolding. A nervous aide slipped a phone toward him. He glanced down. The blood drained from his face. Nearly 2 million views in less than 15 minutes. The realization hit him like a blunt force power was slipping out of the chamber, out of the Senate floor, out of his grasp. It was rushing instead into millions of tiny screens, glowing in living rooms, bedrooms, and buses across America. Crockett sat poised, unflinching, unaware, or perhaps entirely aware, that she had unleashed something larger than herself. The tension in the room stretched thin, as if one wrong word might snap it all together. And beyond the chamber, the questions surged like static in the air. When truth spreads at the speed of Wi-Fi, who really controls the story? Whispers still lingered in the hearing room, carrying fragments of Crockett's testimony like echoes refusing to fade. Senators shifted uncomfortably, adjusting ties and papers, as if the stories she had told might turn their eyes upon them next. J.D. Vance inhaled slowly, forcing composure. He tugged at his tie, straightened his shoulders, and attempted a smirk. But the cameras, merciless in their intimacy, captured the truth, a sheen of sweat at his temple. Restless fingers drumming against the polished wood. The image of unshakable control he cultivated was cracking. Finally, he tried to laugh it off. Heart-wrenching stories, he said, voice edged with sarcasm. Touching, yes, but they don't erase reality. Crime, violence, cities collapsing under their own weight. But before the last word settled, an aide leaned toward him, whispering urgently, "Senator, the clip is at 2 million views. 10 minutes. The words landed like a dagger. Around the chamber, senators' staffers were already hunched over phones, faces illuminated by cold blue screens. They weren't listening to him anymore. They were watching the aftershocks unfold in real time. Crockett didn't interrupt. She didn't need to. Her silence was louder than his defense. Each hollow phrase he uttered felt smaller, thinner, compared to the roar swelling just outside the room. The contrast became unbearable, lived truth against recycled slogans. The cameras shifted again, catching reporters slipping quietly from their seats to make frantic calls in the hallways. They knew the headline had already written itself, and it didn't belong to J.D. Vance. Even his own aides couldn't stop glancing at their screens, verifying the numbers climbing faster than they could refresh. Vance's jaw tightened. He snapped almost reflexively, "This is nothing but cheap political theater." But as if on cue, the giant monitor at the back of the chamber flickered to life, broadcasting the viral clip itself. Crockett's face filled the screen, her words etched in bold across the bottom. "These are not numbers. These are lives." The chamber fell into stunned quiet. The words now looped endlessly, echoing from within the very walls he thought he controlled. Crockett didn't smile. She didn't glance around to measure her impact. She simply sat, spine-straight gaze unwavering, as if she had always known this moment was inevitable. J.D. Vance, suited and seated on high, looked suddenly diminished, smaller than the chair, smaller than the room, a man shrinking inside the shadow of a story too large to silence. But even as Crockett's moral victory crystallized, she understood something Vance did not. Battles are won in chambers, but wars are decided outside. The question pressed heavy in her mind, like a stone she could not set down. Was this victory inside four walls enough to bend the reality waiting beyond them? The hearing chamber was still clenched tight after the giant screen had unexpectedly replayed the viral clip. But Jasmine did not seize the silence to strike again. She inhaled deeply, leaned back in her chair, her eyes drifting into a faraway void, as if she were reaching back into a scar that had never healed. When she spoke, her voice was no longer a political argument. It was a fragment of life torn raw from memory. That day, she said slowly, each word falling heavy as stone, "I saw a piece of paper taped to our front door. Red ink stamped across it, eviction. I was only 8 years old." The entire room froze. Pens slipped from Aids' hands, clattering softly to the floor. Cameras zoomed in tight on her face, capturing every tremor at the corner of her lips. She continued, "My mother worked the night shift in a factory, the day shift cleaning houses. She came home with bloodshot eyes from lack of sleep and still had to tell her little girl, 'Tomorrow we have to leave.' Do you know what that feels like? Not the loss of a house, the collapse of an entire world a child clings to." A few older senators lowered their heads. For a moment, their weathered faces seemed dragged back to the 1970s, the 1980s, to neighborhoods where they too had once seen factories. Close families unravel eviction notices, flutter like autumn leaves. In their eyes, there was not just sympathy, but unease, as if Crockett was forcing them to remember an America they had chosen to forget. Jasmine paused. The silence grew heavier. She didn't need to raise her voice. Her stillness made the chamber suffocate. They called it mismanagement, she said, her tone now steel, but for us it was abandonment. A whole generation reduced to numbers, shoved out as if our lives carried no worth. The camera cut to J.D. Vance. He struggled to hold his composure. Jasmine's words weren't aimed directly at him yet. Each one pierced his armor, puncturing the thin shell of rhetoric he had wrapped around himself. And it wasn't only the chamber that fell silent. Across America, millions sat frozen before television screens, streaming feeds, phones in their palms. They saw in her story their own shadows: a father collapsing after a coal shift, a mother clinging to a crumbling apartment, children growing up beneath the constant terror of losing the roof above their heads. Jasmine looked straight into the camera. Her voice dropped low, almost a whisper, yet it thundered across the nation. "Those scars, I carry them for life. And tonight I bring them here into this room of power to remind us all we cannot turn our backs again." The final word landed like a hammer. The chamber held its breath. No one moved. The feeling in the air was part sorrow, part fury, part relentless urgency. And in that moment, one question hung above them all, like a blade behind the armor of a warrior. How many scars still bleed? The chamber still trembled with the echoes of the childhood scars Jasmine had just ripped open before the nation. Yet she did not stop. Instead, she dragged the room further out of her past, into the path that had forged her, from a displaced child into a lawyer who dared stand in courtrooms against forces that had no intention of hearing the weak. She spoke of her first years as an attorney. Cheap shoes worn thin, sweaty palms clutching files. Each case is more than a matter. Each one a life forgotten, dangling over the edge. A teenage boy in handcuffs for stealing bread. A frail woman in court because she could not pay a fine. An old man shoved to the street over a debt barely larger than a week's wage. They had no one to defend them, Jasmine said, her voice sharp, unyielding. So I stood there. The camera panned to Vance. He wanted to rebut, but he couldn't. These weren't abstractions. They weren't numbers he could bend. They were blood, tears, flesh and bone. Her voice surged like a drumbeat. I learned to turn their tears into testimony, to turn fear into fire. We rarely won, but every time we raised our voices, the powerful had to stop. They had to listen. The words sliced the air, painful, defiant, undeniable. Viewers at home felt their hearts tighten, students scrolling on phones, retired workers slumped before televisions. They no longer saw a congresswoman performing in a hearing. They saw a warrior who had walked through darkness to stand in this chamber. Her words were not history. They were proof that injustice never dies. It only changes shape. She lifted her head, eyes locked with the lens speaking straight into the hearts of millions of American families. If a child who once lost her home can sit in this chamber today, then every dream outside these walls deserves to be heard. Congress cannot belong only to the strong. It must belong to all. The silence that followed was suffocating. In that moment, the line between courtroom and Congress blurred. What remained was only one unbroken journey, the odyssey of a woman who had forged her personal tragedy into a weapon for the people. And the question reverberated like a challenge hurled at the nation itself. Can the journey of one person rewrite the destiny of millions? Jasmine's decision to enter politics had first been dismissed as madness. To the establishment, she was nothing, a frontline lawyer with no name, no money, no allies in power. She won't survive one election cycle, they whispered in corridors, smirking over glasses of wine. But they had forgotten one thing: she was not stepping into this race alone. On the night she announced her candidacy, the rented hall nearly collapsed under the roar of voices. Not businessmen, not donors, but night shift nurses, bus drivers, single mothers clutching babies in their arms. They came because they saw themselves in her, someone who had once been told she didn't belong. Their eyes burned not with hope of miracles, but with the conviction that for the first time, their voices might crash through the marble walls of Congress. The months that followed were grueling and electric. Her battered campaign van rattled across back roads from labor markets to tin-roof neighborhoods. She shook hands in church basements, stood in food pantry lines, listening to stories the press would never cover. The pundits mocked her campaign as amateurish, but each step, each hand clasped, built an underground tide, a tide no pollster could measure. The media scoffed. Politics of sorrow, they sneered. A candidate of feelings. But grainy clips from her town halls spread online like wildfire on cracked phones and kitchen conversations in whispered hope. And then came election night. In power-filled rooms where mocking laughter had once echoed, silence fell like a guillotine. Jasmine Crockett had won. Not with money, not with machinery, with people. With the very people who had been written off as invisible, who turned contempt into ballots, who transformed dismissal into victory. Her triumph was more than personal. It was a slap across the face of a system convinced it alone decided who was worthy of entering Congress. And yet, as she sat now in this suffocating chamber, Jasmine knew the irony. Back then they had underestimated her. Today they still did. But that underestimation was her fuel. Every slight, every sneer sharpened her voice until it cut through walls and carried into the hearts of a nation desperate to believe again. And so the question lingered, not just over Congress, but over America itself. How many more times must a woman like her prove she belongs? The hearing chamber was already ablaze with tension when Jasmine Crockett leaned toward the microphone. Her voice dropped low, sharp as a blade. This was no longer a defense, no longer reacting. This was an attack, her move to flip the board. We talk about broken cities, crumbling neighborhoods. She paused deliberately, letting the air thicken. But do you know that in Appalachia, families are bearing their children from the opioid crisis? They lose sons and daughters, just as mothers in Dallas lose their homes to eviction notices. The room sagged under the weight of her words. Images that seemed worlds apart: an overdosed teenager on a cold mountain town floor, and a mother clutching her child in a condemned housing block, suddenly merged into a single painting of despair. Jasmine wasn't just telling stories. She was slicing open a truth too bitter to ignore. Pain has no zip code. Cameras swept across the senator's bench. Some lowered their eyes, flipping through files, desperate to avoid the glare of the audience. Because the audience was realizing what politics had long concealed: the division between rural and urban was a smokescreen. Poverty, grief, abandonment, these knew no geography. Jasmine pressed forward, her voice hammering, relentless, every syllable, like a swing of a sledgehammer against the walls of prejudice. She spoke of Ronnie, a steelworker in Ohio, jobless after the plant shut down. Then Maria, a nurse in Dallas, worked 3 shifts and was still unable to afford rent. 2 lives, 2 regions, but one shared reality betrayed by the very system sworn to protect them. The audience didn't just listen, they felt the unmasking. A silent tension spread like wildfire, as if the truth now stood towering in the center of the room, leaving no shadow to hide in. Anger began to crystallize into recognition. recognition into something stronger, a thread binding strangers across states into one invisible fabric. In the press gallery, pens froze mid-stroke. Journalists exchanged stunned glances. This was no longer a hearing. This was a stripping away of political costume, revealing a truth few dared to speak aloud. This nation is not split into two halves. It is one body bleeding from a dozen wounds at once. And in that charged silence, Jasmine's question dangled above them, like a guillotine blade. If the borders we've drawn all these years are illusions, then who has truly profited from keeping us divided? The chamber was a pressure cooker when Jasmine Crockett slammed her palm against the table. Her voice cracked like a whip through the air. You call this policy, I call this life. Behind her, the screen lit up with cold graphs, housing prices, medical bankruptcies, foreclosure rates. But Jasmine refused to let numbers drain the blood from reality. She shoved the files aside, eyes drilling into J.D. Vance. An elderly woman in Dallas had to split her insulin dose in half just so she could buy milk for her grandson. Senator, can you look her in the eye and say, "We've done enough"? Vance faltered. He gathered himself, forcing his tone flat calm as if steadiness alone could shield him. Representative Crockett, we cannot take isolated cases and impose them on the entire system. This country is still functioning. Hard choices, hard for who. Jasmine cut him off, like a blade slashing through armor. Her words came fast, searing each strike a lash. Hard for you, sitting in a mansion with thousands of square feet, or hard for the man in Ohio who pawned his wedding ring to buy his wife's medicine. Tell me, Senator, have your numbers ever once made you cry? The air turned to ice. Cameras zoomed tight on Vance's face, the strained smile, the nervous flick of an eyebrow, the fist gripping the desk edge. He tried to counter, I grew up in hardship. I know what it is to go without. But I also know the American people need discipline, not dependence. Jasmine laughed, a sound raw, bitter half scorn, half pain. Discipline, she echoed, leaning forward, voice dropping low but ironclad. You preach discipline to the single mother working 3 shifts and still failing to pay rent, to the veteran who fought for this country only to stand in a food bank line. Senator, will you stand in front of them and lecture morality? Murmurs rippled through the chamber. Some senators lowered their heads. Others shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting anywhere but forward. And in the crack of silence that followed, J.D. Vance swallowed his words. That silence itself was louder than any argument. Jasmine seized it. She pivoted to the camera lens, her voice rising like a battle cry, each word carved in fire. When policy becomes a lifeline, the question isn't what it costs. The real question is who gets to decide who lives and who is left to drown. The hearing ended, but the aftershocks were seismic. Within hours, Jasmine Crockett's office drowned in a tidal wave of phone calls, emails, messages, a deluge, unlike anything her team had ever seen. Every ring, every click carried a story. Every line of text was a pulse of the nation. Thank you for listening to us. You gave us back hope. Screens overflowed with words that were not just gratitude, but raw testimony from lives too long reduced to statistics. One email came from a veteran, his typing shaky. You gave me my dignity back. I no longer feel invisible to my own country. Jasmine read the words again and again. Each sentence cut deeper than steel. Security footage caught her at her desk, eyes glistening, jaw, tight body bracing against the weight of the hope suddenly pressing on her shoulders. The stories kept coming. A mother in suburban Dallas wrote that her son no longer had to drop out of school because of the very housing support Jasmine had fought for. A laborer in Appalachia sent a photo of his calloused hands, writing that thanks to her, he could finally pay rent on time. A boy with a cracked old phone messaged that for the first time in his life, he felt his voice mattered. Each testimony wasn't just data, it was flesh, heartbeat, survival. The charts Jasmine had wielded in the hearing now breathed, pulse, became America itself. Outside, the ripple turned into a storm. Allies watching online whispered in disbelief about the scale of response. Social media detonated. Hashtags surged to the top. Clips of her cross-examining Vance spread like wildfire, millions of views in hours. Ordinary voices, quivering, imperfect, honest, wove together into a pressure no spin doctor could manufacture. Jasmine stood in the eye of it all. Exhaustion hung heavy on her shoulders, but beneath it surged a strange, fierce energy, the kind born only when a people too long ignored, suddenly roared back into history. But as the wave crashed louder, the unspoken question lingered like thunder on the horizon. Will these tears, these words of gratitude harden into a lasting movement? Or will they be swallowed once more by the ruthless machinery of power? Tuyet voi min jadnam, juok yo kao, dik toan bochuang, 6 va 7 sang tieng. An voi fong kash jian an kang, thang bung no kichtinik hu motran chen chin tri. Doi jai la ban dik. The flood of support from voters had barely begun to ebb when a new storm slammed into Jasmine Crockett with merciless force. Critics long waiting in the shadows pounced with sharpened labels, radical, too emotional, unfit for politics. On cable networks, her image was spliced, distorted, remixed into weaponized sound bites. Headlines screamed like artillery fire, Crockett rebel or realist. Is she breaking rules or breaking politics itself? Every frame, every sneer, every manipulated clip landed like an invisible fist aimed at her honor and her resolve. Emails and phone calls poured in from adversaries, not just political challenges, but whispered threats, anonymous messages that curdled the air. At night, Jasmine sat alone in her dim office, the glow of her computer flickering against hollow walls. The light reflected the solitude, the invisible weight pressing on her chest. Her heart pounded, breaths heavy, each hateful word designed to bend her, break her, silence her. Yet Jasmine did not retreat. She reread the messages of support that had flooded her inbox just days before, stories of mothers, veterans, laborers who had found hope in her words. A strange, defiant strength began to rise in her chest. Every insult outside these walls became fuel. Every attempt to break her was tinder for a greater fire. She lifted her phone and one by one replied to the messages of gratitude, her fingers moving with quiet defiance. Thank you. I hear you. I'm not stopping. Between responses, she drafted speeches, mapped strategies, prepared for counterattacks. If they thought she would drown in their storm, they would soon learn she was building a ship from its very waves. Her aides entered carrying grim reports, negative op-eds, multiplying across the internet viral memes, mocking her biased analysis, spreading like wildfire. Jasmine inhaled slowly, eyes fixed on the screen. Her face was cold yet burning with resolve. She was a soldier rearming herself for the next battle. She understood now this fight was no longer about her alone. It was for the millions of silenced voices she carried, for the tears, the thanks, the desperate hope she had glimpsed in her people. But as the messenger becomes the target, the question crackled in the air like thunder before a storm. Would truth be strong enough to withstand the hurricane of lies, or would she pay the ultimate price, her reputation, her safety, perhaps even her faith in the justice she had sworn to defend? The office was cloaked in shadow. Only the faint flicker of her computer and the dim hallway lights kept the darkness at bay. Jasmine Crockett sat slumped, exhaustion pressing her into the chair. Her body ached from head to toe. Every buzz of her phone spiked her heartbeat. Hateful messages appeared in an endless stream. You'll pay for speaking truth. Stop before it's too late. Each threat was a dagger in the quiet. Then another email flashed across the screen. This one from a veteran: you saved my life. You gave me back my dignity. The whiplash between hatred and gratitude left her breathless, her chest tightened, eyes burning. The weight of contradiction tore at her heart, one half dragged into darkness, the other pulled toward hope. Nights stretched long and merciless. The tick of the office clock felt like knives carving seconds into her skin. Tears broke loose when she read a letter from an elderly mother who had lost her home to the very policies Jasmine was fighting to change. You make me proud, but are you well, my child? The words cut deep, reminding her that sacrifice was not measured only in lost comfort or safety. It was measured in strained ties and fractured peace in the fragile threads of family. Rain lashed against the window, a frantic heartbeat pounding on the glass. A call jolted her urgent news: a critical bill was about to be struck down. Leaks online were multiplying, allies panicking. The storm outside mirrored the storm within. Jasmine shut her eyes, inhaled deeply, then pushed herself to her feet. Her voice erupted, hammering through the hollow air. No one gets to break me. I stand for them, for every family abandoned. Her aides looked on, anxious, their reports thick with venom. Direct threats against her safety smear campaigns. Raging protesters swelling outside the building. Jasmine's fists clenched. Her eyes blazed with iron will, her voice trembling but unshakable. They may want me broken, but I will keep rising. No knife, no threat, no campaign of fear can strip this responsibility from me. Still the question clawed at the edge of the silence. How much hatred, how much isolation can one human endure before even the strongest warrior collapses at the fragile border between resilience and ruin? Weeks later, Jasmine Crockett walked back into the hearing room. This time she did not tread lightly. Each step struck like a drumbeat of defiance. I am here. I am unafraid. Her eyes blazed twin flames searing through the chamber. Senators, anchors, adversaries, anyone who wished her silence felt the burn. No longer a victim. She had transformed into a warrior. Her voice thundered across the room. Did you think threats and smear campaigns could break me? J.D. Vance leaned forward, brows furrowed, attempting to interrupt. But Jasmine's fire did not waver. You read reports, Senator, but you've never watched a mother choose between rent and dinner for her children. You've never seen the tears of a veteran denied medicine. Don't you dare call my truth an exaggeration. The chamber froze. Even the calmest aides couldn't disguise their unease. The camera zoomed close, her clenched fists, her pulse racing, the sheen of sweat mixing with the sterile lights. The letters of gratitude and the threats of violence all collided into this moment, becoming a single pulsing force. Every retort, every argument she threw back was not mere rhetoric. It was a blade cutting through the theater of power. Then silence. J.D. Vance tried again, voice cold. You are exaggerating. The reality isn't as dire as you claim. Jasmine inhaled. Time slowed. Every second stretched taut like a string ready to snap. You have never lived in a foreclosed home. You have never heard your child cry from hunger. I do not exaggerate. I represent the silenced. The words detonated like an explosion in the room. Every syllable, every glance, every breath became a symbol of unshakable strength. She had crossed the threshold, no longer just surviving, but leading from the battlefield, turning fear into a shield, pain into a weapon. The chamber's air grew thick, cinematic, electric. Viewers on the other side of the lens felt their own chests tighten, their own pulses race. Jasmine Crockett stood alone, yet unbroken in the storm. And the only question that remained was not whether she could endure, but for how long can one warrior carry the banner of justice before the arrows of lies and hatred finally strike her down. The hearing room fell silent, the cold light spilling across shelves of dusty files. Yet the echo of Jasmine Crockett's words refused to die. A 47-second clip stormed the nation, spreading like wildfire. On college campuses, students whispered her lines like scripture. In union halls, her voice lit heated debates. In small-town churches, parishioners repeated her words as if they were prophecy. They call it mismanagement. I call it abandonment. Her words struck like an arrow, piercing quiet living rooms in Ohio, cramped apartments in Dallas, classrooms filled with restless youth. Social media turned her defiance into a haunting chorus, remixed into music, meme, and into satire, quoted like gospel. A student wept as she replayed the video for her peers. I've never seen anyone speak for us like that. Every syllable sliced through the fog of apathy, forcing eyes open to truths long buried. Meanwhile, old guard senators sat stiff, faces frozen. They recognized what had happened. One speech had done what years of policy papers could not. Her words had leapt over the chamber walls, storming the country with no permission asked. J.D. Vance, once confident in numbers and strategy, faltered. His arguments, now chopped and shared online, rang hollow, brittle, mocked into irrelevance. A colleague muttered under his breath, voice trembling, She turned their pain into a weapon. Jasmine had not just spoken, she had sown a seed. Every line a dare, every look a challenge. Will you stay silent or will you act? In dim halls and crowded kitchens, people whispered back, tentative but rising. A grandmother lifted a trembling hand in a community meeting and recited, They call it mismanagement. I call it abandonment. Her echo spread beyond the room, bouncing across digital walls, radio waves, and living screens. And yet beneath the swelling chorus, one question pressed heavy unrelenting. Were her words strong enough to bend the arc of history, or would they fade, a forgotten echo, swallowed by the machinery of power and apathy? The portraits lining the chamber walls tilted slightly under the weight of history. Barbara Jordan, Shirley Chisholm, giants who once stood alone against prejudice, jeers, and shadowed power. They had lit flames of courage that time could never extinguish. Now Jasmine Crockett entered that same space, the modern heir to their unfinished torch. Her voice did not merely echo within the chamber. It spilled out into streets, classrooms, and kitchens where justice had long been silenced. The camera caught her face in a slow pan, eyes sharp as blades, lips pressed tight, trembling slightly with nerves, but unyielding with conviction. They call me too emotional. They call me radical. But if standing for truth is radical, then I choose that path. Her words reverberated. Online young voices erupted in applause. Elders whispered in awe. Even the weary long, resigned to despair, leaned forward, hearts sparking with light. Crockett invoked stories time could not erase: families, displaced workers, discarded children raised in poverty. She pressed her hand to her heart, voice breaking, but strong. If Jordan and Chisholm stood in the storm to tell the truth, then what would it mean for me to retreat now? An aide whispered, stunned. I've never seen a lawmaker turn anger into power like this. Her cadence was lightning, each word charging the air, each phrase demanding the room confront truths it had long buried. Even Vance sat silent, gaze locked his own pulse, betraying unease as her voice thundered past partisan lines and into the marrow of the people. Jasmine Crockett's power was not office, not title. It was her alchemy, transforming pain and injustice into a flame that refused to die. But as her words faded into silence, a question lingered, heavy, suffocating. Who would carry this torch when every eye turned away? When the voice of justice was pressed down again, would the fire survive or flicker into memory? The chamber quieted, daylight slanting through high windows, casting weary shadows across tense faces. Jasmine Crockett turned toward the door, each step deliberate, pounding like the heartbeat of a nation. The camera followed her. Sweat glistened on her forehead. Wrinkles of strain marked her brow. Behind her, colleagues stared, some stunned, some fearful, all unable to look away. She stopped, pivoted, looked straight into the lens. Her voice shook, yet lashed like a whip across the conscience of every viewer. If you see yourself in these stories, then speak. Act, demand. No one has the right to stay silent while justice is suffocated. The words detonated. They ricocheted through living rooms, down city blocks, across crowded feeds. Even skeptics fell into uneasy silence. A journalist murmured under his breath, "I've never seen truth wielded like a weapon this sharp." But Jasmine did not pause for their recognition. She walked on every step, a dare not to politicians, but to the people. The scene cut outside the chamber, city streets alive with noise, the indifferent hum of traffic. Yet her steps carried the weight of a bridge, spanning the gulf between power and the forgotten. She was no longer just a politician. She was a soldier of justice, bearing a flame through the shadows others feared to enter. Her eyes held the invitation, the demand: pick up the torch. Enter the storm. For the question was no longer whether Jasmine Crockett would fight to the end. The question was whether we, the witnesses, the listeners, would rise, seize the fire, and transform rage and truth into action. Or would we stand idle, watching as silence devoured our conscience? The story did not end in triumph, but in challenge. A challenge that throbbed like a drumbeat in every chest. The moment of choice is here. Do we have the courage not to turn away? The journey of Jasmine Crockett teaches us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the relentless choice to act in spite of it. Change begins when we give voice to truths that others ignore, when we turn personal struggle into collective action. Every small step, every word spoken in defense of justice can ripple far beyond what we see. So ask yourself, what truth are you willing to speak? What action will you take today, even if it feels lonely or dangerous? Remember, this story inspires reflection, not legal or professional advice. Your own judgment matters.